Welcome back to another deep dive into the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, and where the strangest and most horrifying scenarios can unfold across a million worlds. Today, we're exploring one of the most nightmarish situations imaginable in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. What happens when the brutal, chaotic forces of the Orks manage to capture a Grey Knight's Dreadnought, one that has been sealed in stasis sleep for 4,750 years? This is a tale of sacred relics desecrated, of ancient warriors awakening to unimaginable horror, and of two incompatible forces colliding in ways that defy both logic and sanity. Before we delve into this scenario, we need to understand just how monumentally catastrophic this situation truly is. We're not talking about an ordinary Space Marine dreadnought here. We're discussing a Grey Knight's Dreadnought, one of the rarest and most psychically potent war machines in the entire Imperium. We're talking about a warrior who fought demons before the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, who witnessed battles that have been erased from Imperial records, whose very existence is a secret jealously guarded by the Inquisition. And now, this priceless relic, this living connection to the Grey Knight's most ancient past, has fallen into the grease-stained hands of the Greenskins, the Orks, a race whose relationship with technology borders on the miraculous and the absurd in equal measure. The implications of this scenario ripple outward in every direction. For the Grey Knights, the loss of such an ancient brother is not merely a tactical setback, but a spiritual catastrophe. For the Orks, they've stumbled upon the ultimate piece of loot, a shiny metal giant covered in mysterious symbols and filled with gubbins they've never seen before. For the poor soul trapped within the Dreadnought sarcophagus, awakening after nearly 5 millennia of dreamless sleep to find yourself in the hands of Xenos represents a fate that might actually be worse than the demon-haunted nightmares that typically plague a Dreadnought's rest. This is a story about what happens when the Imperium's most secretive and psychically powerful warriors meet the galaxy's most unpredictable and technologically anarchic race. It's about sacred wards clashing with Gestalt psychic fields, about ancient honor meeting brutal pragmatism, about what remains of a man when everything he fought for becomes a distant memory and his new reality is a workshop filled with green-skinned aliens trying to bolt gun barrels to his arms. So settle in, because we're about to explore one of the most unique and disturbing scenarios in the 40K universe, the Grey Knights and their sacred dreadnoughts. To understand the true horror of this situation, we first need to comprehend exactly what a Grey Knight's Dreadnought represents within the hidden chapter that serves as the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus. The Grey Knights are not your typical Space Marines. Every single member of this secretive chapter is a psyker, their gene seed reputedly drawn from the Emperor himself, their training focused entirely on combating the demonic forces of chaos. They are humanity's ultimate weapon against the Imperium's most terrible denizens, warriors whose very presence causes demons to recoil in spiritual agony. A Grey Knight's Dreadnought takes this already formidable concept and amplifies it through centuries or even millennia of service. These are not merely walking weapons platforms. They are living legends, ancient warriors whose psychic might has only grown stronger through their transformation. Each Grey Knight's Dreadnought houses a hero whose deeds were deemed too valuable to lose, whose wisdom and power were considered essential to the chapter's continued existence. They are treated not as weapons of war, but as relics, as living connections to the chapter's storied past, as reservoirs of knowledge about demon fighting that cannot be found in any tome or data slate. Unlike in many other chapters, being interred within a dreadnought is not automatically considered an honor among the Grey Knights. Many battle brothers actually prefer to rest in peace beneath Titan's cool earth, their names carved alongside other fallen heroes in the crypts of the dead fields. The prospect of eternal half-life, of being awakened only for war and then returned to darkness, holds little appeal to warriors who have already sacrificed so much. This makes those who do consent to internment all the more remarkable. They are warriors who understand that their duty transcends their own peace, that their continued service, however torturous, is necessary for the chapter's survival. The construction of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought is a masterwork of both technological and psychic engineering. The chassis itself is built to exacting standards, incorporating the finest materials the Imperium can provide. But what truly sets these war machines apart is the Aegis system, a complex network of protective prayers, runes, and wards that are inscribed into every surface of the Dreadnought and then psychically charged by the chapter's librarians. These wards provide enhanced protection from the sorcerous powers of demonic entities, creating a field of spiritual purity that makes the Dreadnought anathema to creatures of the warp. The pilot within is connected to this system through cyber circuitry, allowing them to link their own psychic defenses to the Aegis field woven into the Dreadnought's armor. This means that a Grey Knight's Dreadnought can project protective wards not just around itself, but around nearby battle brothers, creating reinforced psychic barriers that are far stronger than what individual Grey Knights could manifest alone. In battle against demonic forces, this makes them invaluable force multipliers, spiritual bastions around which the chapter's warriors can rally. Each of the Grey Knight's 8 brotherhoods maintains their own dreadnoughts, and most of these ancient warriors were once Grand Masters or brother captains, leaders who commanded entire companies before their mortal injuries. Some, however, were lower-ranking battle brothers who demonstrated such exceptional courage and psychic potential that the chapter's leadership deemed their preservation essential. The decision to intern a Grey Knight is never made lightly, and the warrior's consent is always required, a recognition of the terrible burden they're accepting. The weapons mounted on Grey Knight's dreadnoughts reflect their specialized role. While they can be equipped with standard armaments like assault cannons and heavy bolters, many carry psychic force weapons scaled to their massive frames. The Nemesis Doomglaive, a massive force weapon that channels psychic energy into devastating close combat strikes, is a favorite configuration. Heavy psycannons, weapons that fire psychically charged rounds capable of disrupting demonic manifestations at the molecular level, provide ranged firepower. Some even carry incinerators that project purifying flame to cleanse corrupted areas, or Nemesis Doomfists that can crush demon princes with blows infused with psychic might. The mind of a dreadnought pilot exists in a state that is difficult for those who have never experienced it to comprehend. They are suspended in amniotic fluid within the sarcophagus, what little remains of their organic body kept alive by life support systems, while their consciousness is neurally linked to the machine's systems. Every sensation is filtered through mechanical sensors. They see through optical arrays. They hear through acoustic sensors. They feel through pressure readings and structural feedback systems. Over time, the line between the warrior and the machine blurs, and many pilots report feeling as though the dreadnought chassis has become their true body. But the worst part is the sleep between battles. Extended neural interface with something as complex as a dreadnought creates immense mental stress, leading to conditions like lethargy, confusion, and even senility. To preserve what remains of their sanity, dreadnought pilots are placed in stasis when not needed for combat. They dream, but these are not the dreams of mortal men. They are fragments of memory mixed with nightmares of battles fought millennia ago, of brothers long dead, of demons banished, and horrors witnessed. Time becomes meaningless in the dark. Years, decades, even centuries can pass between awakenings, and each time the pilot emerges from stasis, they find the world has moved on without them. For a Grey Knight's dreadnought, this isolation is particularly profound. The chapter's battles are rarely recorded in official Imperial histories. Their victories cannot be celebrated openly. The very knowledge of their existence is restricted to the highest levels of the Inquisition. A dreadnought pilot who goes to sleep after a campaign might awaken to find that every battle brother they knew has passed into legend. that the demons they fought have been forgotten by all but the most secret archives, that their entire brotherhood has been replaced by new faces who regard them with a mixture of awe and pity. And yet, they serve. They accept this burden because they understand what's at stake. Every time a Grey Knight's Dreadnought strides onto a battlefield, they bring with them knowledge of demon fighting tactics refined over centuries. They carry wisdom about the nature of the warp and its denizens that cannot be learned from any text. They embody the chapter's unbroken tradition of resistance against chaos, living proof that not a single Grey Knight has ever fallen to corruption in over 10,000 years of service. They are, in every sense, irreplaceable. Now imagine one of these ancient, irreplaceable relics, housing a warrior who fought before the chapter's current Grand Master was even born, who witnessed the banishment of demon princes whose names are now lost to time, who carries secrets about the warp that would drive lesser men mad, falling into the hands of Orks. Imagine this warrior, this living legend, becoming not a tool of the Emperor's will, but a prize in a greenskin scrap heap, subject to the tender mercies of mech boys who have no concept of the sacred, no understanding of what they've captured, no awareness that they're desecrating one of the Imperium's holiest warriors. The ancient sleep, 4,150 years of darkness. 4,750 years. To put that span of time in perspective, that's longer than all of recorded human history on ancient Terra. It's a period that encompasses the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of entire star systems, the gradual drift of the galaxy itself through the cosmos. For a mortal human, it's an incomprehensible eternity. For a space marine, even with their extended lifespans, it represents dozens of generations of battle brothers. For a Dreadnought pilot trapped in stasis sleep, it's a void so vast that when consciousness finally returns, the warrior who awakens may no longer truly be the same person who went to sleep. Let's imagine the circumstances that led to such an extended period of dormancy. Our Dreadnought pilot, whom we'll call Brother Ancient Castiel for the purposes of this narrative, was interred in his sarcophagus during the early years of the 36th Millennium. He had been a Justicar, a squad leader, before a greater demon of Tzinch managed to shatter his body even as he banished it back to the warp. The injuries were catastrophic. His spine was broken in 3 places. His legs were crushed beyond repair. His internal organs were ravaged by warp taint that even the Grey Knight's formidable resistance could barely contain. The apothecaries managed to save his life, but only just, and only by immediately beginning the process of internment. Castiel fought in the Dreadnought chassis for 3 more centuries after his interment, participating in dozens of campaigns against demonic incursions across the Segmentum Obscurus. He banished daemon princes, crushed chaos cultists, and stood as a psychic bastion for his brothers in battles that saw whole worlds consumed by warp storms. He was respected, even revered, by those who fought alongside him. His tactical acumen was legendary. His psychic power, already formidable before his internment, had only grown stronger as the decades passed, and he learned to channel the Aegis system more effectively. But then came the campaign that would lead to his long sleep. The Grey Knights responded to a demonic incursion on a world whose name has been expunged from all records, a place where reality itself had grown thin and the barriers between Materium and Immaterium had nearly collapsed. The fighting was brutal beyond measure. Entire brotherhoods were committed to the battle. Castiel fought at the forefront, his nemesis Doomglaive carving through demon flesh as his psychic wards protected his battle brothers from sorcerous attacks. The final confrontation came in a cathedral that had been twisted by chaos into something that hurt to look upon. There, a Lord of Change, one of Tzinch's most powerful greater demons, had established a throne from which it wove reality-altering magics. Castiel led the assault personally, his ancient chassis shrugging off sorcerous bolts that would have reduced mortal men to gibbering madness. In the climactic battle, he managed to pierce the demon's primary heart with his Doomglaive, disrupting its material form and forcing it back into the warp. But the demon's death curse struck him with devastating force, overloading his psychic circuitry and causing catastrophic damage to his sarcophagus's systems. The victory was complete, but Castiel's condition was critical. His life support systems were failing. The psychic backlash had damaged the neural links that connected his organic brain to the Dreadnought's chassis. The Tech Marines managed to stabilize him, but barely. They declared that major repairs would be necessary, repairs that would require components that might take years or even decades to fabricate and sanctify properly. The decision was made to place Castiel into deep stasis, a state beyond even normal Dreadnought sleep, one where his metabolic functions would be reduced to almost nothing and the damaged systems could be gradually repaired without risking his life. The Tech Marines assured the Chapter Master that the sleep would be temporary, a century, perhaps 2 at most, while they manufactured the necessary components and performed the sacred rituals required to integrate them into such an ancient chassis. Castiel was moved to one of Titan's deepest vaults, a chamber reserved for the most precious relics of the chapter, and there he was sealed away. His sarcophagus surrounded by stasis fields so powerful that time itself seemed to slow to a crawl within their boundaries. But something went wrong. The records are unclear, possibly deliberately obscured by those who felt shame at what happened. Perhaps it was a simple clerical error, a data slate misfiled in the vast archives beneath the citadel of Titan. Perhaps it was a more catastrophic event, a warp storm that disrupted the monastery's systems, or a demonic assault that forced the evacuation of certain deep vaults. Perhaps it was the nature of stasis itself, which can sometimes distort the flow of time in unpredictable ways, making days outside seem like moments within, and moments within stretch into years. Whatever the cause, Castiel was forgotten. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but forgotten nonetheless. The Tech Marines who had been working on his repairs died, and their successors inherited thousands of other projects. The chamber where he slept was sealed, marked in the archives as requiring attention. But that attention never came. Decades became centuries. Centuries became millennia. The Battle Brothers, who had fought alongside him, passed into legend. The demons he had banished were replaced by new horrors. The very strategic doctrines he had helped develop were refined and updated until they bore little resemblance to the tactics he remembered. Outside his stasis field, the Imperium changed in ways both subtle and profound. The Grey Knights fought in countless secret wars, their casualties mounting even as new recruits were found and trained. Titan itself underwent modifications and expansions. New vaults were constructed, old ones were sealed or repurposed. The location of Castiel's chamber was noted in the ancient archives, but as centuries passed, fewer and fewer Tech Marines bothered to consult those dusty records. There were always more immediate concerns, always new dreadnoughts who needed maintenance, always fresh battles that required the chapter's attention. Inside his stasis field, Castiel experienced something that might be called dreaming, but was unlike any dream a waking mind could imagine. Time had no meaning in that state. His consciousness drifted through fragments of memory, reliving battles fought centuries ago, conversations with brothers long dead, oaths sworn in the name of an emperor he would not see again for millennia. Sometimes he was aware of his state, screaming silently in the darkness, desperate to wake, to serve, to fulfill the duty he had accepted. Other times, he was lost in the dreams entirely, fighting endless battles against demons that never quite died, watching his brothers fall in slow motion again and again and again. The neural degeneration that typically afflicts Dreadnought pilots was slowed by the stasis, but it was not halted entirely. Slowly, incrementally, the organic portions of his brain that retained his memories and personality began to deteriorate. The connections between neurons weakened. The structures that encoded his identity started to blur and fade. The man who had been Justicar Castiel, who had led his squad to victory on 100 worlds, who had laughed and bled and prayed alongside brothers he loved. That man was slowly dissolving, replaced by something that remembered being him but could not quite grasp what that had meant. And then, after 4,750 years, came the disaster that would lead to his awakening. The exact nature of that disaster is relevant to our scenario, so let's establish it now. A chaos warband, traitor, Astartes sworn to the dark gods, launched a desperate assault on Titan itself. The Grey Knights repelled the attack naturally, but not before the traitors managed to breach one of the outer defensive rings and plant a series of melter charges in the deep vaults. The resulting explosions caused catastrophic damage to several storage chambers, including the one where Castiel slept. The stasis field that had preserved him for so long flickered and died as its power source was destroyed. Automated systems, detecting the loss of stasis, began emergency protocols to stabilize the Dreadnought's condition. Life support systems that had been barely active for millennia suddenly surged to full power. Neural links dormant for ages sparked back to life. The amniotic fluid in the sarcophagus was cycled and refreshed. And Castiel, ancient Castiel, began the long, agonizing process of returning to consciousness. But he would not awaken in the safe confines of Titan. The damaged vault was deemed unstable, and evacuation protocols were initiated. Castiel's Dreadnought chassis, still inert but no longer in stasis, was loaded onto a transport along with other relics recovered from the compromised chambers. The plan was to move these precious artifacts to a secondary facility for assessment and repair. The transport was escorted by a squadron of Grey Knight strike cruisers, deemed more than sufficient protection for what should have been a routine transfer. What the Grey Knights could not have known was that the Chaos assault on Titan had been a diversion, a sacrifice play designed to draw their attention, while a much larger greenskin fleet approached from an unexpected vector. The Orks, following some inexplicable Xenos logic, had decided this was the perfect moment to raid Imperial shipping lanes in the system. Their arrival was poorly timed from the Imperium's perspective, but catastrophically perfect from the standpoint of creating our nightmare scenario. The transport carrying Castiel was attacked before it could reach the warp translation point. The Grey Knight strike cruisers fought with characteristic ferocity, destroying dozens of Ork vessels and badly damaging the Greenskin flagship. But in the chaos of the battle, with void shields failing and hull breaches spreading across multiple decks, one of the transport's cargo bays was hit by a boarding party. The Orks, looking for anything valuable to loot, found sealed containers marked with symbols they didn't recognize, but which looked important and therefore worth stealing. One of those containers held a Grey Knight's Dreadnought that had been asleep for nearly 5,000 years, a warrior from an age long past, a hero whose deeds had been forgotten by all but the most ancient records. The Orks didn't know what they had captured. They couldn't read the high Gothic warnings inscribed on the container. They had no concept of what a Grey Knight's Dreadnought represented, or what horrors would unfold from this theft. They just knew they'd grabbed something big and shiny and covered in interesting symbols, and that was good enough for them. The nature of Orks and their looting culture. To understand what happens next in our scenario, we need to dive deep into the bizarre and often contradictory nature of Ork society and technology. The Orks are perhaps the most unique intelligent species in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy, a race whose very existence seems to defy the normal laws of physics and logic. They are a hybrid of animal and fungal biology, created millions of years ago by the Old Ones as weapons in their war against the Necrontire. That ancient genetic engineering has left the Orks with capabilities that continue to baffle and frustrate the Imperium's finest minds. Every Ork is born with genetically encoded knowledge about violence and warfare. They don't need to be taught how to fight, they instinctively know. More importantly for our scenario, certain Orks called mech boys are born with an innate understanding of mechanical principles. They don't learn engineering, they simply know it at a genetic level. Knowledge encoded into their very DNA by those long-dead Old One creators. A mech boy can look at a pile of scrap metal and instinctively understand how to turn it into a functioning weapon or vehicle, even if that knowledge is more intuitive than intellectual. But here's where things get interesting, and where Ork technology becomes truly bizarre. Orks generate a collective psychic field, a gestalt phenomenon that is directly proportional to the number of orcs gathered in one place and their collective enthusiasm for whatever they're doing. This psychic field, which the orcs call the Green Tide or the Great Gathering, has measurable effects on reality. It's not that Ork technology works solely because of psychic power, as some Imperial scholars have theorized, but rather that the Gestalt field can enhance performance, fill in gaps in functionality, and sometimes make things work that really shouldn't. The most famous example is the Ork belief that red vehicles go faster. This isn't just superstition. When enough Orks believe it, when a war boss paints his war buggy red and expects it to outpace everything else, the Gestalt field actually can make that happen. The vehicle doesn't violate physics entirely, but it might generate just a bit more power from its engine, or its structural integrity might hold together under stresses that should tear it apart, or its fuel might burn just slightly more efficiently. The effect is subtle but real, and it stacks with the Ork's genuine engineering skill to create technology that is both functional and completely anarchic. This brings us to the Ork practice of looting, which is absolutely central to their culture and particularly important to our scenario. Orks will loot absolutely anything they can get their hands on. They loot weapons from fallen enemies. They loot vehicles from battlefields. They loot entire buildings if they can figure out how to move them. The Death Skulls clan has elevated looting to an art form, painting themselves and their equipment blue because they believe it's a lucky color that will help them acquire more stuff. When an Ork loots something, especially technology, they don't study it carefully or try to understand its function through analysis. Instead, they modify it, often extensively and always violently. They weld on extra armor plates. They bolt on bigger guns. They paint it in their clan colors and add spikes, blades, skulls, and any other decorations that make it look more intimidating. The original function of the looted item often becomes almost unrecognizable under all the Orky additions. Looted Imperial vehicles are particularly common in Ork armies. Leman Russ tanks that have been captured become festooned with additional weapons, their Imperial markings defaced and replaced with Ork glyphs, their interiors modified to accommodate Ork physiology. The Orks don't care that they're using technology they don't fully understand. They know which levers make it go forward and which buttons make the gun go boom, and that's all they need. The Gestalt field fills in the rest, allowing these butchered vehicles to function despite modifications that would horrify any tech priest. The process of looting is both systematic and chaotic. When Orks capture a vehicle or piece of technology, they typically assign a team of mech boys and a horde of Gretchen to work on it. The Gretchen, the smaller cousins of Orks who serve as slaves and laborers, are sent inside to rip out anything the mech boys declare unnecessary. This might include safety systems, targeting computers, ammunition storage, crew compartments, basically anything that doesn't directly contribute to making the vehicle go or shoot. These components are either sold to other mech boys or repurposed into entirely different projects. Meanwhile, the mech boys work on the exterior, welding armor plates over damaged sections, replacing weapons with Ork equivalents, and generally making the captured prize look more Orky. They might replace a Leman Russ's battle cannon with a kill cannon, swap out its heavy bolters for big shooters, add a reinforced ram to the front for extra crumping power. They work by instinct and experience, slapping things together in ways that seem haphazard, but somehow result in functional war machines. Testing the looted vehicle typically involves having some unlucky Ork, often a bad moons boy if they can grab one, pilot the thing around the scrapyard while the mech boys watch to see what breaks. If the vehicle explodes immediately, well, that's just how it goes. If it manages to drive around and shoot stuff without falling apart, it's declared ready for battle. the fact that it might still have a 50% chance of catastrophic malfunction doesn't bother the Orks in the slightest. That's just part of the fun. The Ork Gestalt field plays a crucial role in this looting process, though exactly how is a subject of much debate among Imperial scholars. The prevailing theory is that the field doesn't make completely non-functional technology work, but it does smooth over gaps in understanding and functionality. An Ork-looted weapon that should jam after every third shot might fire reliably because the Orks expect it to. A vehicle that should need complex maintenance rituals to start might roar to life with a simple pull of a lever because the Ork doesn't know it should be difficult. Some Imperial records suggest that looted technology won't work at all in non-Ork hands, lending credence to the Gestalt field theory. Other accounts, including reports from Imperial Guard units that have captured Ork equipment, indicate that Ork technology is merely extremely crude and unreliable rather than psychically dependent. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle, with Ork construction being functional enough to work on its own, but enhanced and stabilized by the collective belief of nearby greenskins. This looting extends beyond just vehicles and weapons. Orks have been known to loot buildings, converting Imperial fortifications into their own ramshackle bases. They've looted entire space hulks, tearing apart the fused ships and rebuilding them into new configurations that somehow remain void-worthy. They've even attempted to loot more exotic things, with mech boys trying to steal demon engines, Eldar technology, and Necron constructs with varying degrees of success and disaster. The larger and more unusual the looted item, the more prestige it brings to the mech boy who successfully converts it. There are legends among the Orks of a looter called Grabber Gutzbag, who supposedly managed to loot entire Imperial Titans, massive walking war machines that tower over the battlefield. While such tales are likely exaggerated, they illustrate the Ork mentality. If it's big, shiny, and covered in gubbins, it's worth looting, regardless of how impractical or dangerous that might be. Ork warbosses love to claim the best looted equipment for themselves, seeing it as symbols of their power and cunning. A warboss who rides to battle in a looted Imperial tank, covered in Ork modifications and trailing black smoke, is making a statement about his dominance. He's not just defeating his enemies, he's taking their stuff and using it against them. The ultimate insult in Ork society. The more impressive the loot, the more it reinforces the warboss's position and attracts more Orks to his banner. Now, armed with this understanding of Ork looting culture and their bizarre relationship with technology, imagine what happens when they encounter something they've never seen before. Something that combines cutting-edge Imperial technology with ancient psychic wards. Something that houses a living warrior who has fought demons for longer than their entire clan has existed. Imagine mech boys looking at a Grey Knight's Dreadnought, covered in inscriptions they can't read, powered by systems they don't understand, and thinking only one thing: that's a proper big metal git, and it's going to be mine. The capture. How this nightmare begins. The space battle around the Grey Knight's transport had turned into a desperate melee, the kind of chaotic void combat that Orks excel at and that disciplined Imperial forces struggle to contain. The Ork fleet, a ramshackle armada of repurposed Imperial vessels, Xenos constructs, and ships that looked like they'd been hammered together from asteroid fragments, swarmed the Grey Knight's cruisers like predators circling wounded prey. The disciplined volleys of lance batteries and torpedo spreads from the Grey Knight's ships carved through Ork vessels with devastating precision. But for every greenskin ship destroyed, 2 more seemed to appear from the roiling mass of their fleet. The transport carrying Castiel and the other recovered relics was not a warship. It was a heavy freighter that had been pressed into service for this supposedly routine transfer, its holds filled with precious artifacts salvaged from Titan's damaged vaults. It had void shields, certainly, and some defensive armaments, but it was never meant to survive the kind of assault it now faced. When an Ork kill cruiser, A massive converted Imperial heavy cruiser, covered in guns and ramming spikes, smashed through its void shields and latched boarding claws onto its hull. The transport's fate was effectively sealed. The Ork boarding parties that poured through the breached hull were a chaotic mixture of boys, knobs, and what appeared to be every Ork who could grab a weapon and a boarding torpedo. They crashed through bulkheads with brutal efficiency, their crude but effective boarding shields deflecting the desperate fire from the transport's minimal security forces. The few Grey Knights aboard, primarily tech marines and support staff, fought with their characteristic skill and psychic might, but they were vastly outnumbered and couldn't be everywhere at once. In one of the transport's cargo holds, sealed containers holding relics from Titan sat in neat rows, each one marked with high Gothic warnings and purity seals. The Orks who burst into this chamber had no idea what they were looking at and didn't particularly care. What they saw was a room full of locked boxes with Imperial markings, which meant whatever was inside had to be valuable. The largest container, a reinforced transport pod big enough to hold a Dreadnought chassis, immediately drew their attention. It was covered in symbols that glowed with a faint silver light, and even the Orks, whose psychic sensitivity is limited, could sense that something unusual was inside. A knob named Grogzag, who led this particular boarding party, immediately claimed the big container for himself. He was a massive Ork, even by his species standards, his armor covered in trophies from previous raids, and his power claw crackling with barely contained energy. He barked orders in the guttural Ork language, and his boys immediately set to work trying to move the container back to their boarding craft. They discovered it was far heavier than expected, heavy enough that it took a dozen Orks and a jury-rigged pulley system to even budge it. This only made Grogzag more determined to claim it. In Ork logic, if something was this heavy and this well protected, it had to be important. Maybe it was full of teeth, the Ork currency. Maybe it was weapons. Maybe it was something shiny he could wear to look more intimidating. Whatever it was, he wanted it, and what a knob wants, his boys had better deliver unless they wanted to get a taste of his power claw. The Grey Knight's strike cruisers were fighting desperately to reach the transport, but they were tangled up with the bulk of the Ork fleet. One managed to break through the greenskin line and unleashed a devastating broadside that crippled the kill cruiser attached to the transport, but it was too late. The Orks had already dragged their prizes, including the container holding Castiel, into their boarding craft and were detaching from the dying transport. Within minutes, they had fled back into the mass of the Ork fleet, which was already beginning its chaotic retreat, now that the Grey Knights' reinforcements were arriving in force. The Grey Knights pursued, naturally. Every ship carrying recovered relics from Titan was precious, and losing even one to Xenos was intolerable. But Ork fleets are masters of the fighting retreat, their ships covering each other with interlocking fields of Dakar, while their mech boys performed emergency warp jumps that no sane Imperial navigator would attempt. The kill cruiser, carrying Grogzag and his loot, made 3 successive warp transitions in rapid succession, each one jumping in a seemingly random direction with no apparent pattern or destination. For the Grey Knights pursuing them, this was a nightmare. Their vessels were faster and better armed, but they couldn't match the sheer recklessness of Ork navigation. The greenskins jumped without proper calculations, without checking for warp storm activity, without any of the safety protocols that kept Imperial ships from being lost in the Imperium. Several Ork vessels were lost in those jumps, torn apart by warp turbulence or translated into regions of space thousands of light years from their intended destination. But enough survived, including the kill cruiser carrying Grogzag's prize. When the kill cruiser finally emerged from the warp, it was in a system the Orks knew well, a junkyard world they had claimed decades ago and turned into a massive scrap heap and shipbuilding facility. This was Ork territory, deep in a region the Imperium had all but abandoned, where greenskin clans fought each other as often as they raided Imperial space. The kill cruiser limped into orbit, its engines smoking, and its hull scarred from both the battle with the Grey Knights and the turbulent warp journey. Grogzag didn't care about the ship's condition. He had his prize, and he was eager to see what was inside. The container was offloaded to the surface, dragged by massive tractor crews of Gretchen overseen by whip-wielding Orks. It was taken to a workshop complex, one of the sprawling facilities where mech boys worked on everything from gun repairs to starship construction. The place was a maze of metal lean-tos, forge pits, and piles of scrap that towered higher than Imperial hab blocks, all of it echoing with the sounds of hammering, welding, and the occasional explosion. The container was set down in what passed for a clear space, and Grogzag gathered a crowd of mech boys to crack it open. These weren't the most skilled technicians in the clan, just the ones who happened to be nearby and looked like they knew which end of a wrench to hold. They studied the container's seals for approximately 3 seconds before one of them suggested just smashing it open with a power claw. This suggestion was met with universal approval, and Grogzag stepped forward, his weapon crackling with energy. The seals on a Grey Knight's transport container are designed to withstand tremendous force and are blessed by tech marines to resist tampering. They held for exactly as long as it took Grogzag to hit them 3 times, after which they shattered in a spray of blessed ceramite and machine oil. The container's doors swung open, and the Orks got their first look at what they'd stolen. Inside, standing silent and inactive in its transport cradle, was a Grey Knight's Dreadnought. Even dormant, even stripped of some of its external weapons for the transport, it was an imposing sight. The chassis stood nearly 4 meters tall, its armor plates inscribed with thousands of wards and runes that still glowed with a faint silver light. The sarcophagus at its center was sealed with more inscriptions, these ones spelling out prayers in High Gothic and languages even older. Empty weapon mounts on its arms spoke of missing armaments, but the Dreadnought's sheer mass and presence were intimidating even without them. The Orks stared at it for a long moment, and then Grogzag broke the silence with a booming laugh. He had no idea what he was looking at, no concept of what a Dreadnought was, or what horrors it had witnessed. He just saw a big metal warrior covered in interesting symbols, and thought it was the best piece of loot he'd ever grabbed. The other Orks quickly joined in his enthusiasm, already shouting ideas about what they could do with it, what weapons they could bolt on, what modifications would make it properly Orky. None of them noticed that the life support systems inside the sarcophagus were active and functioning. None of them realized that the amniotic fluid within was being cycled by automated systems. None of them understood that the neural links inside were beginning to activate, responding to stimuli from the outside world, attempting to wake a warrior who had been asleep for nearly 5,000 years. And absolutely none of them had any concept that the psychic wards covering every surface of the Dreadnought were about to encounter the most incompatible force they had ever faced, the Gestalt psychic field of the greenskin race. Inside the sarcophagus, in the darkness of a sleep that had lasted for millennia, something began to stir. Neurons that hadn't fired in thousands of years started to activate. Synapses, long dormant, began to reconnect. The mind of Brother Ancient Castiel, what remained of it after so long in stasis, started its agonizing journey back toward consciousness. He had gone to sleep in the sacred vaults of Titan, surrounded by his battle brothers, secure in the knowledge that he would be awakened when the chapter had need of him. He was about to wake up in the hands of Xenos, in a scrapyard on a world he didn't know, thousands of light years from any Imperial presence, with greenskin mech boys already discussing how best to take him apart and put him back together in ways that would make the Omnissiah weep, and the true horror of his situation hadn't even begun yet. First contact, Ork discovery, and fascination. The workshop where the captured Dreadnought had been placed quickly became the center of attention for every mech boy within walking distance. Word spread through the scrap heap with characteristic Ork speed. Grogzag had looted something proper killy, something big and shiny and covered in mysterious gubbins. Within an hour, the area around the inactive war machine was crowded with Orks of all sizes and specializations, each one offering opinions about what it was and what should be done with it. "It's a metal Humi," declared one mech boy, a relatively small greenskin who specialized in armored vehicles. "Look at the shape, yeah? Like one of them Space Marine gits, but bigger and harder." "Nah, it's a walking gun platform," argued another. This one covered in oil stains and missing 2 fingers from his left hand, presumably from previous experiments. "See the weapon mounts on the arms? We just gotta bolt some proper shooters on, and it'll be ready to crump." A third mech boy, older and scarred, pushed his way through the crowd to get a closer look. His name was Fragbits, and he was known throughout the clan for his ability to make looted Imperial equipment actually work, sometimes for entire days before it exploded. He studied the Dreadnought with a level of attention unusual for an Ork, his small eyes narrowing as he examined the runes and wards covering its surface. "This ain't normal Humi tech," Fragbits declared, his voice carrying enough authority that the other mech boys quieted down to listen. "Look at all dem scratches and symbols. They're all over it, yeah? And see that?" He pointed at the sarcophagus, where the silver glow of the wards was slightly brighter. "Something in there is still working. This thing ain't dead, just asleep like." This revelation caused a fresh wave of excitement. An inactive war machine was one thing, valuable certainly, but not nearly as interesting as one that might still be functional. The Orks pressed closer, and one of the bolder ones reached out to touch the armor plating. The moment his fingers made contact, he jerked back with a yelp. "It shocked me," he complained, shaking his hand. "Proper zappy it was." Fragbits grunted and produced a crude device that looked like a combination of a scanner and a cooking pot. He waved it near the Dreadnought's surface and watched as needles spun wildly on its face. "There's power in this thing, lots of it. And not just power, something else too. Like when the weird boys get all worked up before a fight, yeah? Tingly like." What Fragbits was detecting, though he had no way of understanding it, was the Aegis system. The psychic wards covering the Dreadnought were still active, still drawing power from the micro-reactors that kept the life support systems running. These wards were designed to repel demonic entities, to create a field of spiritual purity that chaos could not easily penetrate. They had never been designed to deal with Orks, a race whose psychic presence was so fundamentally different from both human psykers and demons that the wards didn't quite know how to respond. The gestalt field generated by the growing crowd of Orks was beginning to interact with the Aegis system in unprecedented ways. The wards flickered, their silver glow pulsing irregularly as they encountered psychic energies they had no template for processing. To a trained librarian of the Grey Knights, this would have been cause for immediate alarm. To the Orks, it just made the whole thing more interesting. Grogzag, who had been watching this investigation with growing impatience, finally pushed forward and grabbed Fragbits by the shoulder. "Stop mucking about with your magic box and tell me, can we make it work?" Fragbits scratched his chin, leaving an oil stain across his green skin. "Maybe, yeah, but we gotta get inside first, see what makes it tick. Might be we can just stick an Ork in there and have him drive it about. Might be we gotta rip out the guts and put in new ones. Won't know till we crack it open." "Then crack it open," Grogzag demanded. "I want to see what's inside this thing." "Right, yeah, but see, there's a problem." Fragbits pointed at the sarcophagus. "That's where the important bits are, yeah? All sealed up tight with more Adem symbols. We start smashing on it without knowing what we're doing. Might break something important. Might make the whole thing explode even." The prospect of an explosion was not nearly as deterring to Orks as it would be to saner species. Several of the gathered mech boys actually perked up at the mention, clearly thinking that an explosion would at least make things more interesting. But Grogzag, unusually for an Ork, showed a flash of something almost resembling caution. "Fine, then we do it careful like," he growled. "Get your best boys, the ones what know about Humi tech. Take this thing apart slow, yeah? Figure out how it works. And once we know that, we make it better. We make it Orky." This pronouncement was met with general approval, and Fragbits immediately began selecting mech boys for the project. He chose those who had experience with looted Imperial equipment, particularly the ones who had worked on captured Land Raiders and Lehman Russ tanks. They might not understand exactly what they were looking at, but they could at least recognize common Imperial components and would know better than to just smash everything with a hammer. The Orks set up a proper workspace around the Dreadnought, or at least as proper as Ork workshops get. They dragged over tool crates, set up welding equipment, and brought in a crane system that looked like it had been looted from an Imperial construction site. Gretchen were assigned to the menial tasks, holding tools, fetching parts, and generally being underfoot until they got kicked out of the way. As this preparation was underway, one of the younger mech boys noticed something odd. "Oi, the tingly feeling is getting stronger. Any ore you lot feel that?" The others paused and concentrated, which for Orks meant standing very still and frowning deeply. Several of them grunted in agreement. The air around the Dreadnought did feel different, charged somehow, like the moment before a lightning strike. The runes on its armor were glowing more brightly now, pulsing with an almost rhythmic pattern. Inside the sarcophagus, Castiel's return to consciousness was accelerating. The life support systems had detected activity around the Dreadnought and interpreted it as preparation for deployment. Automated protocols that were designed to ready the pilot for combat were engaging, flooding his system with stimulants and combat drugs, activating neural pathways, bringing him up from the depths of stasis sleep with increasing urgency. But the awakening was all wrong. Castiel's consciousness emerged in fragments, memories and sensations jumbled together without context or order. He remembered being sealed in stasis on Titan, being told it would only be for a century or two. He remembered battles against demons on worlds whose names he could no longer recall. He remembered brothers whose faces had blurred into indistinct shapes. He remembered being a flesh and blood warrior once, though that memory was so old it felt like it belonged to someone else. His awareness expanded into the Dreadnought's sensor systems, and that's when the real confusion began. The optical feeds should have shown him the familiar sight of Titan's fortress monastery, or perhaps a battlefield if he was being awakened for combat. Instead, they showed him a scene that made no sense whatsoever. Massive green-skinned Xenos creatures surrounded him. Crude structures made of scrap metal filled his vision. The air quality sensors reported an atmosphere thick with industrial pollutants and engine fumes. Castiel tried to move, to activate his weapon systems, to defend himself against these obvious Xenos threats. But the Dreadnought didn't respond. His neural links were active. He could sense that, but the connection between his thoughts and the machine's limbs was incomplete. It was like trying to move arms that had fallen asleep, a maddening disconnect between intent and action. He could feel the massive chassis around him, could sense its power systems humming with energy, but he couldn't make it obey his commands. The Orks, oblivious to the growing consciousness within their prize, had begun their examination in earnest. Fragbits directed Gretchen to clean off centuries of accumulated dust and grime from the Dreadnought's exterior, while his mech boys studied the various access panels and maintenance hatches. They quickly realized that Imperial engineering was far more complex than they were used to. "Desse are all locked up tight," one mech boy complained, trying to pry open an access panel on the Dreadnought's torso. "Got some kind of fancy mechanism I can't figure out." "Try blasting it," suggested another helpfully. "We're not blasting nothing yet," Fragbits snapped. "Use your brain if you got one." "If this thing's still powered up, blasting random bits might set off the whole machine. And we're standing right next to it, yeah?" This logic, sound enough even by Ork standards, convinced them to try a more delicate approach. They studied the locks, poked at them with various tools, and eventually one mech boy thought to check if any of the mechanisms were simply corroded and stuck rather than actually locked. This turned out to be partially correct, and with some application of lubricant, the lower access panels finally came open. What they found inside made absolutely no sense to them. The interior of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought is a marvel of engineering, combining advanced technology with psychically attuned components, and sacred wards woven into every system. To the mech boys peering inside, it looked like someone had taken a dozen different machines and smashed them together into an incomprehensible mess. Cables ran in patterns that seemed to follow no logical layout. Components were marked with symbols they couldn't read. Everything hummed with power, but gave no indication of what it actually did. "This is proper confusing," one of the mech boys admitted. "Never seen Humi tech what looks like this." "That's because these ain't regular Humies," Fragbit said thoughtfully. He'd been studying the symbols on the exterior and had noticed something. They were different from the usual Imperial markings. These were more elaborate, more intricate, almost artistic in their complexity. "These are the weird Humies, the ones what fight the demon things. Heard the war boss talk about 'em once." The mention of demons caused a stir among the gathered Orks. Fighting demons was considered particularly good sport, mainly because demons could fight back in all sorts of entertaining ways, and because Orks were largely immune to the spiritual corruption that made demons so dangerous to humans. The fact that they'd looted technology from warriors who specialized in demon fighting made the prize even more valuable in their eyes. Meanwhile, inside the sarcophagus, Castiel was beginning to panic. His consciousness was fully awake now, his mind processing sensory information and reaching a horrifying conclusion. He had been captured by Xenos. The sounds filtering through his acoustic sensors were definitely not High Gothic. The chemical signatures his systems were detecting didn't match anything in his databases. Most damning of all, he could feel alien psychic energy pressing against the Aegis wards, a presence that was both chaotic and strangely focused. He tried again to move, pushing his will through the neural interfaces with desperate urgency. This time, the Dreadnought responded, but only slightly. One of his arms twitched, servos whining as they engaged. The movement was tiny, barely noticeable, but to the Orks standing right next to the machine, it was very apparent. "It moved!" one of them shouted, jumping back in alarm. "The arm moved!" The workshop erupted in excited chatter. If the machine could move, that meant it was wakeable, that they might be able to get it working without having to completely rebuild it. Fragbits moved closer, his oil-stained hands reaching toward the arm that had twitched. "Easy there, big fella," he said, speaking to the Dreadnought as if it could understand him. "We're not gonna hurt you. Well, not much anyway. Just gonna take you apart a bit, put you back together better like. Gonna make you proper Orky, we are." For Castiel, hearing alien voices speaking a language he couldn't understand, feeling Xeno's hands touching his chassis, understanding that these creatures planned to disassemble and modify him, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would only get worse. He redoubled his efforts to move, to activate any weapon system, to send out a distress signal. But the connections were still incomplete. His will could only manifest as tiny, fitful movements that the Orks interpreted as interesting mechanical responses rather than desperate attempts at resistance. The stage was set for a technological and psychic collision, unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. A Grey Knight's Dreadnought, ancient and sacred, covered in psychic wards designed to repel demons, about to be modified by Ork mech boys, whose Gestalt psychic field represented everything the Aegis system was not designed to handle. The results would be catastrophic, bizarre, and utterly unprecedented. The looting process commences. The first actual modification attempt happened 3 hours after the Dreadnought was brought into the workshop. Fragbits had spent that time studying the machine from every angle, consulting with other mech boys, and occasionally hitting different parts of it with a wrench to see how they sounded. His conclusion was that they needed to start with something simple, replacing the missing weapons. "See them mounts on the arms?" he explained to his assembled crew. "Dem's for weapons, yeah? Whatever it had before is gone, but we got plenty of guns what'll fit there. We bolt on some proper shooters, then we can test if the rest of the machine works." The mech boys enthusiastically agreed with this plan. One of them immediately suggested a pair of def guns, massive Ork assault weapons known for their spectacular rate of fire and tendency to explode if overheated. Another argued for big shooters, reliable by Ork standards and available in quantity. A third proposed they mount a shock attack gun, a weapon so dangerous that even Orks treated it with some caution, but was shouted down when Fragbits pointed out they only had one shock attack gun in the entire camp, and the big mech who owned it would likely kill anyone who tried to steal it. They eventually settled on a compromise, One arm would get a rocket launcher, a shoulder-mounted weapon that fired self-propelled explosive projectiles, and the other would get a custom mega blaster, an energy weapon that fired devastating beams but had a distressing tendency to overload and fry its user. Both weapons were available in the workshop's stockpile, and both looked properly intimidating. The process of mounting these weapons revealed just how different Ork engineering was from Imperial design. The weapon mounts on a Grey Knight's Dreadnought are precision-engineered to specific tolerances, with neural feedback systems that allow the pilot to aim and fire with thought alone. They're blessed by tech marines and inscribed with prayers to the Omnissiah. They're designed to interface seamlessly with the Dreadnought's targeting systems and ammunition feeds. The Orks, naturally, ignored all of this. They took measurements with their eyes, cut metal plates to approximately the right size, and began welding the new weapons in place, using arc welders that threw sparks everywhere and occasionally set nearby Gretchen on fire. When the weapon mounts didn't quite line up with the Ork weapons, they simply cut away the parts that didn't fit and welded on crude adapter plates. Castiel, trapped inside the sarcophagus, experienced this process as a series of increasingly alarming sensations. He could feel through the Dreadnought's sensors as the Xenos cut into his chassis. The pain wasn't physical. He had no physical body to speak of anymore, but the violation of his machine form was agonizing in a different way. Each cut sent feedback through the neural links. Each weld created a burning sensation across his consciousness. He tried to shut down these connections, to retreat into the core systems and protect what remained of his sanity, but the automated protocols kept pulling him back toward full awareness. The worst part was the psychic contamination. The Aegis wards that covered the Dreadnought were beginning to react to the Ork modifications in unpredictable ways. Every time an Ork welded something to the chassis, every time they bolted on a new component, the wards flickered and pulsed, trying to repel the alien presence, but unable to do so effectively. The gestalt field of the gathered Orks was pressing against the Dreadnought's psychic defenses like a rising tide, and those defenses had no protocol for dealing with this particular type of psychic energy. The wards had been designed to repel the predatory, corrupting influence of chaos. They recognized demons as enemies and manifested barriers of spiritual purity to keep them at bay. But Orks weren't trying to corrupt anything. They weren't attempting to twist the Dreadnought into a demon engine or subvert its machine spirit. They were just modifying it, enthusiastically and carelessly, with no malicious intent beyond making it more shooty and fighty. The wards didn't know how to respond to this kind of neutral but enthusiastic psychic presence. "That's the rocket launcher mounted," one mech boy announced, stepping back to admire his work. The weapon was now attached to the Dreadnought's left arm mount via what appeared to be a combination of welds, bolts, and wire. It was pointed roughly in the right direction and looked like it might actually fire, though whether it would hit anything was another question entirely. "Right, now for the Mega Blaster," Fragbit said, directing a team of mech boys to lift the heavy energy weapon. This proved more challenging than the rocket launcher. The Mega Blaster required a power connection, which meant they needed to somehow link it to the Dreadnought's power systems. After some discussion and several arguments, they decided to simply crack open one of the power conduits they'd found in the lower access panel and splice the weapon directly into it. This was, from an engineering standpoint, absolutely insane. The Dreadnought's power systems were carefully balanced and regulated, with safeguards to prevent overloads and feedback loops. The Mega Blaster, meanwhile, drew power in unpredictable spikes and had minimal internal regulation. Connecting the two directly should have resulted in an immediate catastrophic failure, but this was where the Ork gestalt field began to have its first real effect on the captured war machine. As the mech boys completed the splice, wrapping crude insulation around exposed cables and liberally applying bolts, welds, and what appeared to be chewing gum to hold everything in place, something strange happened. The power flow from the Dreadnought stabilized, routing itself around the new connection in ways that the Mechanicus would declare impossible. The Mega Blaster hummed to life, its power coils glowing with an ominous blue-green light. "It works!" declared the mech boy who'd done the splice, sounding more surprised than triumphant. Fragbits grunted approvingly. "Course it works, you git. Now we gotta test the whole thing, see if the metal Humie inside knows how to use his new shooters." This comment made several of the orcs pause. "Wait, there's a Humie inside this thing?" "Course there is," Fragbits said impatiently. "Why else would it have that big coffin bit in the middle? That's where the pilot sits, yeah? Probably all shriveled up like a Gretchen, kept alive by the machine. Seen something similar when we looted that other walker, the one what exploded." The idea that there was an actual living being inside the Dreadnought made the whole project even more interesting to the orcs. They pressed closer to the sarcophagus, peering at it with renewed interest. One of them knocked on it with his knuckles, producing a hollow metallic sound that echoed through Castiel's audio sensors like thunder. "Can he hear us?" one mech boy wondered. "Dunno," Fragbits admitted. "Oi, you in there? Can you hear us, Humie?" Castiel could indeed hear them, though their alien language remained incomprehensible. What he understood was that they knew he was inside, that they were treating him like some kind of curiosity, rather than a warrior deserving of respect or fear. The humiliation burned even through his terror. He was a grey knight, a demon slayer, a warrior who had served the Emperor for centuries before his internment and millennia since. And he was being gawked at by Xenos, who had turned him into some kind of project, who were discussing him like he was a piece of interesting salvage. He tried once more to move, to activate the weapon systems, to do anything that might make these aliens understand that he was still dangerous. The Dreadnought lurched, servos grinding as power suddenly flooded through systems that hadn't been active in millennia. The newly attached rocket launcher swiveled, its crude mounting allowing for more movement than its designers probably intended. The Mega Blaster's power coils flared brighter. The orcs scattered, though more from excitement than fear. "It's waking up! The Humie's trying to move!" Fragbits held his ground, studying the Dreadnought's movements with professional interest. "Calm down, you gits. It's just testing its joints. Can't do much more than that, not yet. The power's all wrong. And I bet the pilot can't see nothing without proper sensors hooked up." This was actually correct. Castiel's visual feeds were scrambled and incomplete. The sensors had been partially disconnected during the transport, and the orc modifications had damaged some of the remaining connections. He could see fragments, flashes of green-skin faces, and crude structures, but nothing coherent enough to target properly. His weapon systems were responding to his commands, but without proper targeting data, he couldn't aim. He was like a blind man swinging a sword, dangerous but largely ineffective. The orcs, realizing that the Dreadnought wasn't about to start shooting at them, resumed their work with renewed enthusiasm. If the pilot inside was waking up, that meant they needed to finish the modifications quickly so they could test the whole machine properly. Fragbits directed his crew to work on multiple fronts. One team to repair and reconnect the sensor systems, another to reinforce the new weapon mounts with additional welding, a third to paint over the Imperial markings and replace them with proper orc glyphs. This last task created an unexpected problem. The orcs who tried to deface the psychic wards found that their paint wouldn't stick to the inscribed runes. They'd slap on a layer of red paint, and within minutes, it would bubble and peel away, revealing the silver script beneath. They tried thicker paint, used different colors, even attempted to grind off the runes entirely with power tools. But the wards resisted every effort. "Daisy scratches won't come off," complained the orc, tasked with the repainting. "Every time I cover 'em up, they come back." Fragbits examined the phenomenon with growing frustration. "Must be some kind of magic Humie trick. Fine, leave the symbols for now. We'll paint around 'em, make it look like we meant for 'em to be there, decorative-like." This decision would have far-reaching consequences. By leaving the Aegis wards largely intact, even while mounting orc weapons and modifying the Dreadnought systems, they were creating a hybrid machine that combined two fundamentally incompatible forms of psychic engineering. The wards were designed to create a field of spiritual purity and order. The orc modifications were infused with the chaotic but focused energy of the Gestalt field. The two forces, should have cancelled each other out or created a catastrophic psychic backlash. Instead, something stranger was beginning to happen. The wards, unable to repel the Ork presence, but still trying to fulfill their function, began adapting in ways they were never designed to. They started treating the Gestalt field not as an enemy to repel, but as a foreign energy source to filter and redirect. The psychic feedback loops this created were subtle at first, barely noticeable even to a trained psyker, but they were growing stronger with every modification the Orks made. Inside the sarcophagus, Castiel felt this change as a creeping wrongness that spread through his connection to the Dreadnought. His Aegis wards were meant to protect him from demonic corruption, to keep his soul pure even when surrounded by the worst horrors the warp could manifest. Now they were doing something else entirely, something he couldn't quite identify, but that filled him with a deep sense of violation. It was as if his very spiritual essence was being contaminated not with chaos, but with something equally alien and far more incomprehensible. The looting process continued through the day and into the night, lit by the flames of forges and the sparks of welding torches. More Orks gathered to watch and offer suggestions. A war boss passed by and demanded a demonstration, leading to several tense minutes where the mech boys tried to explain that the machine wasn't ready yet, and the war boss threatened to smash it for being useless. They eventually satisfied him by showing how the arms could move and the weapons could swivel, which was enough to convince him to leave them alone for now. By dawn of the next day, the Dreadnought looked radically different from when it had arrived. The clean silver armor was now partially covered in crude Ork repairs and modifications. The weapon mounts sprouted a rocket launcher and a custom mega blaster, both secured with enough bolts and welds that they probably wouldn't fall off on the first use. Additional armor plates, cut from looted Imperial vehicles and welded on at random angles, covered sections where the Orks had damaged the original armor during their examination. Red and black paint, the colors of Grogzag's clan, had been slapped onto every surface where the psychic wards allowed, creating a patchwork effect that was distinctly Orky. And inside the sarcophagus, Brother Ancient Castiel reached a conclusion that would have been unthinkable for a Grey Knight under normal circumstances. He needed these modifications to work. His situation was desperate beyond measure. He was cut off from the chapter, surrounded by Xenos on a world he didn't know, trapped in a war machine that had been desecrated by alien hands. But if he could somehow gain control of the Dreadnought despite the modifications, if he could make the Xenos weapons respond to his will, he might be able to fight his way free, or at least die in battle rather than as a prisoner. It was a horrifying compromise, accepting the desecration of his sacred chassis in order to survive. But Castiel had not served the Emperor for millennia by being inflexible. He was a Grey Knight, trained to face the absolute worst the galaxy could offer and find a way to endure. If that meant working with Ork technology, with weapons that had no right to function, and modifications that violated every principle of sacred engineering, then so be it. He would survive, he would escape, and he would find a way to make these Xenos pay for what they had done. The question was whether his iron will could overcome the fundamental incompatibility between his psychic wards and the Gestalt field that now permeated every new component attached to his chassis. The answer to that question would determine not just his fate, but potentially the fate of everyone on this greenskin-infested world. Psychic complications and the Aegis system. To understand the true depth of the crisis developing within and around the captured Dreadnought, we need to delve into the metaphysical mechanics at play. The Aegis system of the Grey Knights represents some of the most sophisticated psychic engineering in the Imperium, a harmonious integration of technology and spiritual power that has been refined over 10 millennia. The Ork Gestalt field, by contrast, is a primordial psychic force, raw and chaotic, operating on principles that defy conventional understanding of how psychic powers should work. The Aegis begins with the physical inscriptions that cover every surface of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought. These are not merely decorative. Each rune, each prayer, each ward has been carefully crafted by the chapter's librarians and then psychically charged through rituals that can take months to complete. The inscriptions form interlocking patterns of spiritual protection, creating overlapping fields that reinforce each other. A demon attempting to approach a Grey Knight's Dreadnought would encounter layer upon layer of psychic barriers, each one designed to cause it pain and disorientation while strengthening the resolve and purity of the pilot within. The pilot's own psychic power is integral to this system. Through the cyber circuitry installed in the sarcophagus, a Grey Knight's Dreadnought pilot can channel their own psychic might directly into the Aegis, creating a feedback loop where the wards protect the pilot and the pilot strengthens the wards. This creates a field of what Imperial psychers call sanctified reality, a bubble of space where the laws of the Imperium are reinforced and the influence of the warp is actively suppressed. Within this field, demons lose some of their power. Chaos sorcery becomes more difficult to manifest, and the natural corruption that emanates from all things warp-touched is neutralized. The Ork Gestalt field operates on completely different principles. It's not consciously directed like Grey Knight's psychic power. Orks don't meditate or train their psychic abilities beyond the weird boys, and even those specialists are channeling rather than controlling the field. Instead, the Gestalt field emerges spontaneously from the collective unconscious of the Ork race. When Orks gather together, when they share common goals and beliefs, when they get excited about a fight or a project, their individual psychic signatures combine and amplify each other. This field doesn't impose order on reality like Grey Knight's psychic power does. Instead, it introduces a kind of directed chaos, bending probability and physics in subtle ways that align with Ork expectations. If an Ork believes a gun will work, the field makes it slightly more likely that it will. If enough Orks believe red vehicles go faster, the field ensures that they do, by mechanisms that even the most learned Imperial scholars cannot fully explain. It's psychic power, divorced from individual will, a collective force that responds to group psychology rather than personal training or discipline. When these two forms of psychic manipulation encountered each other in the modified Dreadnought, the results were predictably unpredictable. The Aegis wards, detecting psychic energy that didn't match any template for demonic corruption, initially tried to repel it. The silver light of the wards pulsed brighter whenever Orks came near, and some of the greenskins reported feeling uncomfortable or tingly when they touched the Dreadnought's surface. But the Orks weren't being driven away by spiritual agony like a demon would be. They were just mildly annoyed, which wasn't enough to make them stop their modifications. As the Ork modifications continued and the Gestalt field strengthened around the Dreadnought, the Aegis began to adapt. This shouldn't have been possible. The wards were designed with fixed parameters, locked into specific patterns by the psychic charging rituals performed when they were first inscribed. But the cyber circuitry connecting Castiel to the Aegis created a variable element in the system. His consciousness, his psychic power, was active and responsive rather than static. And as he struggled to maintain control over his chassis despite the modifications, as he tried desperately to filter out the alien psychic presence he could feel pressing against his awareness, the Aegis began to shift its configuration. Castiel became aware of this change gradually, in moments when his attention wasn't consumed by pain or panic. He could feel the wards responding to his will in ways they never had before, becoming more flexible and adaptive. It was as if the alien psychic energy pressing against them was forcing them to evolve, to develop new defenses against a threat they were never designed to counter. He tried to direct this adaptation to shape the wards into a barrier that would repel the Ork influence entirely. But he quickly discovered a terrifying limitation. He needed the Ork Gestalt field, or at least he needed its effects on the modified systems. The rocket launcher and custom mega blaster that had been bolted to his arms should not have functioned at all when connected to Imperial power systems. The tolerances were wrong, the interfaces incompatible, the entire design philosophy fundamentally different. Yet they worked, at least partially, because the Gestalt field was filling in the gaps in functionality, making connections that shouldn't exist, and stabilizing systems that should fail. If Castiel pushed the Aegis to completely repel the Orcs' psychic influence, the modified weapons would stop functioning. His targeting sensors, which the Orcs had repaired using scavenged parts and generous applications of their Gestalt field, would fail. Even some of his core systems, damaged during the initial capture and patched with Orc components, might cease operation. He would become a lifeless statue of adamantium and ceramite, helpless and unable to fight. This realization forced him to make a decision that went against every instinct and teaching he had received as a Grey Knight. He had to allow the alien psychic energy to permeate his chassis. Not completely, he would resist full contamination with every fiber of his being, but enough to keep the modified systems operational. It required a delicate balance, using the Aegis to filter and control the Gestalt field's influence rather than repelling it entirely. The process was agonizing. Castiel could feel the Orc psychic energy seeping into systems that had been sanctified and blessed, could sense it interacting with components that had been carefully crafted to resist all forms of spiritual corruption. Every moment felt like a violation, like he was allowing something fundamentally wrong to touch his very soul. But he forced himself to maintain control, to shape the interaction between the Aegis and the Gestalt field rather than trying to eliminate it. The result was unprecedented in Imperial history, a Grey Knight's Dreadnought whose psychic wards were actively cooperating with Orc psychic power. The Aegis didn't just tolerate the Gestalt field. It began to channel and redirect it, using the raw psychic energy to stabilize the modified systems, while simultaneously preventing that energy from corrupting the core components. Silver light and green psychic energy swirled together across the Dreadnought's surface in patterns that would have horrified any librarian who witnessed them. The Orcs, naturally, had no idea what they were witnessing. They could see that the Dreadnought's runes were glowing more brightly and that the whole machine seemed to hum with power, but they interpreted this as a sign that their modifications were working. Fragbits declared it a complete success and ordered his team to move on to the next phase, getting the pilot fully synchronized with the modified systems and teaching him to use his new Orky weapons. "We need Dahumi inside to wake up proper-like," Fragbits explained to Grogzag, who had returned to check on the progress. "Right now he's half asleep, just reflexes and such. We gotta get him fully awake and aware so he can learn to work the new gubbins." "And how we do that?" Grogzag asked. Fragbits grinned, showing his metal-capped teeth. "Same way we wake up any sleeping git. We make enough noise that he can't ignore us no more." What followed was perhaps the least dignified awakening ceremony any Grey Knight's Dreadnought had ever experienced. The Orcs gathered around the machine and began making as much noise as possible. They hammered on the armor plating with wrenches and hammers. They shouted in their guttural language, competing to see who could be loudest. They fired weapons into the air, the reports echoing off the scrap metal structures surrounding them. Several Gretchen were assigned to climb onto the Dreadnought and jump up and down while screaming, though this mostly resulted in them sliding off the curved armor plating and falling to the ground. Inside the sarcophagus, Castiel experienced this cacophony as an assault on every sensor at once. The acoustic pickups were overwhelmed by the noise. The vibration sensors reported impacts from every direction. The optical feeds, still only partially functional, showed flashes of green skin faces pressing close to his viewports. It was sensory overload of the highest order, and it had exactly the effect the Orcs intended. It forced him to full consciousness, shocked him out of the half-aware state he'd been maintaining. His mind, sharpened by shock and necessity, began processing information at full capacity for the first time since awakening. He catalogued his situation. Captured by Orcs, heavily modified with Xenos technology, psychic systems compromised, weapons unfamiliar, location unknown, no support available. It was the worst possible scenario for a Grey Knight, isolated and surrounded by Xenos with no hope of rescue. But he was still alive. His psychic power was intact, perhaps even enhanced by the strange interaction between the Aegis and the Gestalt field. His consciousness remained his own, uncorrupted by chaos or broken by despair. He was a Grey Knight, and Grey Knights did not surrender, did not accept defeat, did not allow Xenos to use them as tools or trophies. If the Orks wanted to wake him up fully, then he would oblige them. And then he would show these greenskins exactly what it meant to face a warrior of the Emperor, even one trapped in a desecrated chassis on a world far from any Imperial presence. The real horror was about to begin. Not for Castiel, but for the Orks, who thought they had successfully looted a docile piece of equipment, rather than awakening an ancient and very angry demon slayer. The pilot's horrifying awakening. The full awakening of Brother Ancient Castiel happened in a cascade of sensory input that would have driven a lesser mind into immediate madness. His consciousness, which had been fragmented and confused, suddenly snapped into sharp focus as all his systems came online simultaneously. The amniotic fluid in his sarcophagus registered as cold against what remained of his organic form. The neural links, buried in his brainstem, flared with activity as they established full connection to the Dreadnought systems. Every sensor, every servo, every weapon mount reported its status directly to his awareness. The first coherent thought he managed to form was a prayer to the Emperor, something he had recited 10,000 times before in countless battles. Emperor, guide my hand, make my aim true, let me be your instrument of justice. But the prayer felt hollow now, contaminated by the knowledge of what had been done to his sacred chassis. He could feel the alien modifications even through the prayer, like grit in a smooth bearing. His optical sensors came online with painful clarity, and for the first time since awakening, he could see his surroundings properly. The workshop was a nightmare of disorder to a mind trained in the precise organization of Imperial technology. Scrap metal was piled in unstable heaps that reached toward the sky. Forge fires burned in crude pits with no proper ventilation. Gretchens scurried between the legs of Orks, carrying tools and components while trying not to get stepped on. And everywhere, covering every surface, were Orks. Crude, brutal, and entirely too pleased with themselves. Castiel's audio sensors translated their guttural language into something his transhuman mind could parse, at least partially. The neural augmentations that had been part of his transformation into a space marine, then further enhanced when he became a Grey Knight, included capabilities for rapid language acquisition. It was a painful process, his consciousness struggling to find patterns in the alien phonemes and assign meaning to their structure. But gradually, he began to understand fragments of what the Orks were saying. "Think it's fully awake now," one of them was saying, the one who seemed to be in charge of the project. "See how its eye lights are glowing brighter. Can it understand us?" another Ork asked, leaning in close to the sarcophagus. Its breath, if you could call it that, wafted across Castiel's chemical sensors, a mixture of fungal spores, industrial chemicals, and what his systems identified as trace elements of promethium. "Only one way to find out," the leader replied. "Oi, you in there! Can you hear us, Metal Humi?" Castiel considered his options. He could remain silent, pretend to be inactive or non-responsive, but his strategic analysis subroutines, still functioning despite everything, suggested that this would be counterproductive. The Orks would simply continue their modifications, potentially causing more damage. If he could communicate, even with Xenos, he might be able to affect what they did next. Might be able to guide their actions towards something he could work with. The Dreadnought's vocal synthesizers had been damaged in the capture and further degraded by the Ork modifications, but they were still partially functional. Castiel channeled power to them, felt the ancient mechanisms grinding to life, and spoke his first words in nearly 5,000 years. What emerged from the Dreadnought's speakers was a sound that made several Orks step back in alarm. It was a voice, recognizable as such, but layered with static and distortion that made it sound like it was coming from the depths of the warp itself. Each word was drawn out and mechanical, filtered through systems that were only barely maintaining coherence. "I am awake." The workshop went silent. Even the Gretchens stopped their scurrying to stare at the massive war machine that had just spoken. The Orks exchanged glances, some excited, some nervous, all of them suddenly very aware that this was not just a machine, but something that could think and respond. Fragbits recovered first, his mech boy curiosity overcoming his surprise. "Well, look at that. The metal Humie can talk. That's proper useful, that is. Now we can ask him things." "Ask him what?" Grogzag rumbled, pushing through the crowd to stand directly in front of the Dreadnought. "Ask him how the weapons work, for starters, and how to make him walk around, and if he's got any idea where we can find more things like him to loot." Castiel listened to this exchange with growing horror, his military mind cataloguing each violation of protocol, each desecration of what he represented. These Xenos thought he would help them, thought he would provide information about Grey Knight's technology and tactics. The sheer audacity of it would have been almost admirable if it wasn't so completely enraging, but he forced down his anger, channeled it into cold calculation. He needed information about his situation, needed to understand where he was, how long he'd been captured, what had happened to the Grey Knights who had been transporting him, and he needed the Orks to keep him functional long enough to formulate an escape plan. "Where am I?" he asked, each word requiring conscious effort to produce through the damaged vocal systems. Fragbits seemed delighted that the Dreadnought was asking questions. "You're on our world, Metal Humie. Best scrap pile in the sector. We grabbed you from them other Humies. The silver ones what were transporting you. Gave us a right good fight, they did, but we got away with the loot." Silver armor. That confirmed what Castiel had feared. The Orks had attacked a Grey Knight's vessel and captured him during the theft, which meant the chapter would be looking for him, eventually. But how long would that take? And would they even know where to look? The Orks had mentioned fleeing through multiple warp jumps. He could be anywhere in the galaxy. "How long?" he asked. "How long? Since capture?" The Orks consulted among themselves, and Castiel realized they had no clear concept of time measurement that matched Imperial standards. Eventually, Fragbits just shrugged. "Couple of days, maybe. Long enough to get you here and start fixing you up. Not long enough for the Humies to track us. We're safe, yeah?" Days. He'd been in Ork hands for only days, but it felt like an eternity. And the modifications they'd made in that time, modifications that should have taken skilled tech marines weeks to plan and execute, had been slapped together in what the Orks considered a rush job. The casual competence was almost as disturbing as the situation itself. "Why?" Castiel asked. "Why modify me?" This question seemed to confuse the Orks. Grogzag stepped forward, his massive form looming over even the Dreadnought. "Why?" "'Cause you're loot, that's why. We grabbed you, so now you're ours. And when we grab something, we make it better, more orky. That's just what we do, innit?" "You." Castiel's vocal synthesizers crackled with static as emotions he had thought long suppressed surged through his consciousness. Desecrate. Sacred. Machine. Sacred. Fragbits laughed. A booming sound that was echoed by the other Orks. "Mate, you're just a big metal git with guns on your arms. Ain't nothing sacred about that. But we're gonna make you proper killy, we are. Gonna turn you into the best fighting machine on this whole world." The complete lack of understanding, the total absence of any recognition of what the Dreadnought represented, hit Castiel harder than any physical blow could have. These Xenos had no concept of the Emperor, no awareness of the Imperium, no comprehension of the 10,000 years of service the Grey Knights had rendered against the forces of chaos. To them, he was just loot, a broken toy, they could fix up and play with. But even through his rage and despair, Castiel's tactical mind was working. The Orks wanted him to fight. That meant they would arm him, would provide him with power, would give him the tools he needed to break free. He just needed to survive long enough to use those tools effectively. "Show me," he said, forcing the words through the damaged synthesizers. "Show me weapons." This request was met with immediate enthusiasm. The Orks crowded around, pointing out the rocket launcher and custom mega blaster they'd mounted on his arms. They explained, in their crude way, how each weapon worked, how the rocket launcher needed to be loaded with projectiles and fired manually, how the mega blaster drew power from the main reactor and needed time to cool between shots. Castiel listened and learned, absorbing information even as part of his mind screamed at the violation of everything he'd been taught. These were Ork weapons, crude and dangerous and completely unsuitable for a warrior of his caliber. But they were weapons nonetheless, and in the hands of someone with his experience and psychic power, they could be made devastatingly effective. "Can you move?" Fragbits asked. "Can you walk around? Or we gotta fix something first?" This was the critical question. Castiel had felt his motor systems responding earlier, knew that he could control the Dreadnought's movements at least partially. But walking, actually bearing his own weight and maintaining balance, would require full integration with the modified systems, would require accepting the Ork components as part of his chassis, working with the Gestalt field rather than fighting against it. He reached out with his consciousness, felt for the servo motors in the Dreadnought's legs, traced the power flow through systems that were half Imperial and half Ork. The connections were rough, crude, held together as much by the Gestalt field as by the physical welds and bolts. But they were there, and with careful application of his will, he might be able to make them work. Castiel sent commands through the neural links, felt power surge through the leg servos, experienced the mechanical feedback as the Dreadnought shifted its weight. The first movement was jerky and uncontrolled, nearly toppling him. But he adjusted, compensated, remembered the training from when he'd first been interred, and had to learn to walk again in a body of metal rather than flesh. Slowly, grinding against seals that had been inactive for millennia, the Dreadnought rose to its full height. The Orks scattered, giving it room to move, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Castiel took one step, then another, each movement accompanied by the whine of servos and the clank of adamantium feet on the scrap metal floor. He was walking, moving under his own power for the first time in nearly 5,000 years, and he was doing it in a chassis that had been desecrated by Xenos, modified with alien technology, contaminated with psychic energy that made his Aegis wards burn with adaptive fury. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so completely horrific. The Orks erupted in celebration, whooping and hollering and firing weapons into the air. They'd done it. They'd successfully looted and modified a piece of technology they didn't understand and made it work. Fragbits was already planning the next modifications, talking about adding more armor, mounting a bigger gun, maybe putting a grot in the sarcophagus with the Humi pilot to help with the fighting. But Castiel was only partially aware of their celebration. Most of his attention was focused inward, on the strange new reality of his existence. He had thought he understood what it meant to be a Dreadnought, to exist as a consciousness in a machine. But this was different. This was being a hybrid, part Imperial technology and part Ork scrap, held together by a Gestalt psychic field that he had to actively channel and control. It was like walking a tightrope between two forms of madness, trying to maintain his identity and purpose while allowing alien influence to permeate systems that should have been sacred. And the worst part, the part that would haunt him if he lived long enough to escape this nightmare, was that it was working. The Ork modifications, for all their crudeness and incompatibility with proper engineering, were functional. The Gestalt field was filling in gaps and stabilizing systems in ways that actually made sense from a certain perspective. He was more capable now, in some ways, than he had been before the modifications. because the Ork components gave him options and weapons he hadn't possessed as a purely Imperial Dreadnought. This realization settled over him like a shroud. He had always believed that Imperial technology, blessed and sanctified, was superior to anything the Xenos could produce. Had always trusted that purity and proper procedure would triumph over innovation and adaptability. But here he was, living proof that sometimes contamination could create capability. The thought was more disturbing than facing any demon had ever been. The Orks continued their celebration, already planning their next use for their new prize. They talked about pitting him against other looted vehicles, seeing how well he could fight. They discussed taking him on raids, using his psychic wards, which they didn't understand but could see glowing, to protect them from weird stuff. They imagined a future where he would be their champion, their pet metal Humie, fighting their battles and making them famous across the scrap heap. Castiel listened to their plans and said nothing. Let them think he was compliant. Let them believe he had accepted his new role as their tool. He would bide his time, learn their weaknesses, master the hybrid systems they had forced upon him. And when the moment came, when he had gathered enough strength and knowledge, he would turn all of it against them. He was a Grey Knight. He had banished demons and fought horrors that would drive mortal men mad. He would not be defeated by greenskins, no matter how long it took, no matter what compromises he had to make. He would find a way to escape, to return to the Imperium, to warn the chapter about what had happened. And if he couldn't escape, then he would at least ensure that these Orks paid dearly for what they had done. The nightmare had only just begun, and Brother Ancient Castiel was far from finished fighting. Ork modifications and desecration. Over the following weeks, measured in the grinding passage of time that Castiel experienced through his chronometer systems, the Orks continued their modifications with increasingly ambitious and disturbing results. What had started as simple weapon replacements evolved into a comprehensive overhaul of nearly every aspect of the Dreadnought's systems. The Orks approached each modification with the same casual enthusiasm they brought to all their projects, unaware that every change they made drove another spike of psychic and spiritual agony through the consciousness of the warrior trapped within. The first major addition came when Fragbits decided the Dreadnought needed more armor. He had noticed during initial tests that while the adamantium plating could withstand Ork weapons fire reasonably well, there were gaps in coverage that could be exploited. His solution was characteristically Orky: weld on additional plates of armor scavenged from destroyed vehicles, regardless of whether they actually fit or matched the Dreadnought's aesthetic. A squad of mech boys descended on the chassis with cutting torches and welding equipment, slicing armor plates from a looted Lehman Russ tank and bending them to fit over the Dreadnought's torso and shoulders. The process was agony for Castiel, not physically, but through the feedback of systems being cut into, modified, and reinforced without any regard for the sacred geometries that had gone into the original design. Each weld sent pulses of sensation through his awareness, like someone was performing surgery on his body without anesthetic. The armor plates themselves were crude compared to the original adamantium, but they were thick and functional. More disturbingly, the Orks painted them bright red, the color of their clan, completely covering sections that had once borne the silver heraldry of the Grey Knights. Castiel could feel the psychic wards beneath the paint, still active, but now hidden, their light suppressed under layers of Ork coloring. It felt like being buried alive, his identity concealed beneath an alien shell. The next modification was even worse, the addition of what the Orks called a proper melee weapon. Fragbits had noticed that the Dreadnought's original power fist was missing, presumably removed during transport, and he decided to replace it with something more Orky. The weapon he chose was a massive chain chopper, essentially a giant chainsaw blade mounted to a hydraulic arm. It had been salvaged from a destroyed Ork vehicle and was so large that it took 3 Orks working together to lift it into position. Mounting the chain chopper required cutting away part of the Dreadnought's right arm weapon mount and replacing it with a crude but functional rotating joint that the Orks had fabricated from scavenged Imperial components. The installation took an entire day, with mech boys arguing about proper weight distribution and whether the mounting would hold under combat stress. In the end, they just added more bolts and welds until they ran out of room to add more, then declared it ready. Castiel tested the chain chopper once it was installed, sending commands through the neural links and feeling the weapon roar to life. The sensation was disturbing, the brutal vibration of the chainsaw teeth, the smell of promethium from the fuel system, the weight of the weapon throwing off his balance in ways he had to compensate for. But he couldn't deny its effectiveness. The chain chopper could shred through armor and flesh with terrifying efficiency, and in the hands of someone with his combat experience, it would be devastating. The modifications continued with smaller, but no less violating additions. The Orks installed spotlights, looted from Imperial vehicles, to help with navigation in the dark. They added smoke launchers, taken from destroyed tanks, that could fill an area with obscuring clouds. They bolted on trophy racks, which they promptly filled with skulls and other gruesome decorations to make the Dreadnought look more intimidating. Each modification was accompanied by the same casual efficiency, the same lack of understanding about what they were doing to a sacred relic. One particularly disturbing addition came when a pain boy, the Ork equivalent of a medic, insisted on examining the sarcophagus more closely. This green-skinned doctor was fascinated by the idea of a living being kept alive inside a machine and wanted to improve the life support systems. Castiel tried to refuse, tried to make the Dreadnought systems reject the pain boy's probing instruments, but Fragbits overruled him, insisting that maintaining the pilot's health was important for the machine's continued function. The pain boy's examination was crude and invasive. He opened access panels that should never be opened, poked at systems he didn't understand, and generally treated the sacred sarcophagus like it was an interesting puzzle to be solved. Castiel endured this violation with gritted determination, keeping his consciousness as separate from the physical examination as possible. The pain boy eventually declared that the Humi pilot was a bit shriveled but still alive, and suggested adding some extra nutrient feeds to keep him fresh. The nutrient feeds the pain boy installed were connected to Ork biochemical systems, designed for greenskin physiology rather than transhuman space marine biology. They shouldn't have worked at all, should have poisoned Castiel, or at least caused severe digestive distress. But the Gestalt field, combined with Castiel's own formidable constitution and the Aegis wards filtering the contamination, somehow made them functional. The nutrients were alien and tasted wrong through the sarcophagus's chemical sensors, but they kept him alive, which was the only thing that mattered. As the modifications accumulated, the Dreadnought began to take on an identity that was neither purely Imperial nor purely Ork. The core structure was still recognizably a Castroferrum pattern Dreadnought, but every surface had been altered. Red and black paint covered most of the chassis, interrupted only by the silver glow of the Aegis wards that refused to be completely concealed. Ork glyphs had been added alongside the original High Gothic inscriptions, creating a bizarre linguistic palimpsest. The weapons were a mixture of Imperial and Xenos technology, held together by welds, bolts, and the Gestalt field's reality-bending influence. The Orks began referring to the Dreadnought as Grogzag's metal git, claiming it as a trophy belonging to their knob. They made it participate in what they called training exercises, which consisted of having Castiel fight against other looted vehicles and captured equipment. These fights were both humiliating and informative. Humiliating because Castiel was being forced to perform for Xenos entertainment. Informative because they gave him crucial practice with the modified systems and weapons. The first such exercise pitted him against a looted Lehman Russ tank, one that the Orks had modified even more extensively than they had the Dreadnought. The tank was covered in additional guns, spikes, and armor plates, and its crew consisted of 3 Orks who thought ramming was a perfectly valid combat tactic. Castiel destroyed it in approximately 4 minutes, using the Mega Blaster to cripple its treads, and then closing to melee range with the chain chopper. The Orks watching the fight cheered enthusiastically, completely unconcerned that one of their vehicles had just been reduced to scrap. Subsequent exercises followed a similar pattern. The Orks would pit Castiel against various opponents, and he would systematically destroy them while learning how to use his hybrid systems more effectively. He discovered that the rocket launcher, for all its crude construction, could be remarkably accurate if he compensated for its tendency to veer left. The Mega Blaster required careful power management to prevent overheating, but could punch through armor like it was paper when properly charged. The Chain Chopper needed constant maintenance to keep the teeth sharp, but once it bit into a target, it was almost impossible to stop. Throughout all of this, Castiel maintained his psychic discipline, using the Aegis to filter and control the Gestalt field that permeated every modified component. This required constant concentration, a mental balancing act that never ceased even during rest periods. But it had an unexpected benefit. He was becoming more sensitive to the Gestalt field itself, learning to predict its fluctuations and use them to his advantage. He discovered that when Orks were watching him fight, when they were excited and shouting encouragement, the Gestalt field strengthened and his weapons performed better. The rocket launcher's projectiles flew straighter. The Mega Blaster charged faster. Even the Chain Chopper seemed to bite deeper into targets. It was as if the Ork's belief in his effectiveness was making him more effective, a self-fulfilling prophecy powered by psychic energy. This discovery was both useful and deeply disturbing. It meant he was benefiting from the very contamination he despised, using alien psychic power to enhance his combat capabilities. But it also meant he had a potential weapon against the Orks themselves. If he could manipulate their expectations, if he could make them believe certain things about his capabilities, he might be able to turn the Gestalt field into a tool for escape, rather than just a means of survival. The modifications eventually reached a point of diminishing returns, where the Orks couldn't think of anything else to add without completely rebuilding the Dreadnought from scratch. Fragbits declared the project complete and presented Grogzag with a weapon that was part Imperial war machine, part Ork scrap heap, and entirely unprecedented in its combination of technologies. Grogzag, looking at what his mech boys had created, announced his intention to use the modified Dreadnought in a raid against a nearby Ork settlement that had insulted his clan. This would be Castiel's first real combat deployment since Awakening, his first chance to use the hybrid systems against actual enemies rather than training targets. It would also be his first opportunity to explore the possibility of escape, to see if he could turn the Orks' own weapon against them. But before any of that could happen, before Castiel could formulate a complete plan, something unexpected occurred that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. A weird boy, one of the Ork psychers who could channel the Gestalt field consciously, visited the workshop to see the famous modified Dreadnought everyone was talking about. And when the weird boy got close enough to sense the psychic energies swirling around the chassis, when he felt the interaction between the Aegis wards and the Gestalt field, he reacted in a way that nobody, least of all Castiel, could have anticipated. The weird boy screamed, clutched his head, and started babbling about shiny Humy thoughts and weird Bernie magic and something wrong with this one boss, something proper wrong. The other Orks tried to calm him down, but the weird boy kept insisting that the Dreadnought was dangerous, not because of its weapons, but because of what it was doing to the Gestalt field, twisting it and shaping it in ways that made his head hurt. This was the moment when Castiel realized that his careful manipulation of the psychic energies hadn't gone unnoticed, that there was at least one greenskin who could sense what he was doing. And more importantly, it was the moment when he understood that the interaction between his Aegis wards and the Ork Gestalt field might have consequences far beyond just keeping him alive and functional. The real complications were about to begin. The clash of psychic forces. The weird boy's reaction to the modified Dreadnought sent ripples of concern through the Ork camp, though not for the reasons an Imperial observer might expect. The Orks weren't worried about spiritual contamination or demonic possession. They were concerned that their prize might explode in a shower of psychic energy and take half the workshop with it. weird boys were notorious for their unstable powers, but they were also generally considered accurate sensors for when something weird and dangerous was happening. Fragbits tried to get more specific information from the weird boy, whose name was Zagbolt, and who was currently rolling on the ground and moaning about too many colors what shouldn't be together. After some coaxing and the application of a bucket of cold water, Zagbolt managed to articulate his concerns more coherently. "Da metal Humi," he said, pointing at the Dreadnought with a shaking finger, "is doing something to the big green energy, yeah? He's taking it and twisting it, making it flow different like. Ain't never felt nothing like it. It's like he's building walls out of our energy, channeling it where he wants it to go instead of where it should be going." This description was remarkably accurate, though Zagbolt had no framework for understanding what he was sensing. What Castiel had been doing, unconsciously at first, but with increasing deliberation, was using his Aegis wards to create what a trained Imperial psyker would recognize as psychic conduits and filters. The wards were redirecting the Gestalt field's energy away from the core systems that needed to remain purely Imperial in function while channeling it into the modified Ork components. It was an incredibly sophisticated piece of psychic engineering, the kind of thing that usually required multiple librarians working in concert. "Is that bad?" Grogzag asked, his massive hand resting on his power claw in case the answer required violence. "Bad? Nah, not exactly," Zagbolt said, scratching his head. "Just weird, and it makes me head hurt when I get too close. But the metal Humi ain't exploding or summoning demons or nothing, so I guess it's fine. I think?" Fragbits considered this assessment carefully. On one hand, having a weird boy declare something was making his head hurt was usually a sign that psychic problems were imminent. On the other hand, the Dreadnought was working better than any looted equipment he'd ever seen, and the modifications were holding up far better than they should. If the Humi pilot had figured out some way to make the whole thing more stable, that was good, right? "Keep an eye on it," Grogzag ordered. "You," he pointed at Zagbolt, "check in on the metal Humi every now and then. Make sure he ain't doing anything too weird. And you," he turned to Castiel's chassis, "try not to make the weird boy's head explode, yeah? We need him for the raid." Castiel, listening to this exchange through his now functional audio sensors, realized he needed to be more careful. He had assumed the Orks wouldn't notice his psychic manipulation, that their crude understanding of such things would blind them to the subtle work he was doing. The presence of a weird boy who could actually sense psychic phenomena changed that calculation significantly. He would need to be more subtle, more controlled in how he shaped the energies around him. But the revelation also gave him valuable information. If a weird boy could sense his psychic work, that meant the Gestalt field was more reactive to conscious will than he had realized. The Orks might not understand it intellectually, but their weird boys could manipulate it directly, which meant that if Castiel could learn to understand the Gestalt field well enough, he might be able to use it as a weapon, turning the Orks' own psychic power against them. Over the next few days, Zagbolt visited the workshop regularly, always approaching cautiously and complaining about the weird, burny feeling that got stronger when he got close to the Dreadnought. Castiel studied the weird boy during these visits, observing how he interacted with the Gestalt field. It was completely different from how a Grey Knight would use psychic power. There was no meditation, no careful focusing of will, no structured ritual. The weird boy simply opened himself to the Gestalt field and let it flow through him, channeling it instinctively rather than controlling it precisely. This gave Castiel an idea. If the weird boy was a conduit for the Gestalt field rather than a controller of it, that meant the field itself was the primary force, with the weird boy serving more as a lens than a source. Which meant that someone who could actually control psychic energy, someone with the training and discipline of a Grey Knight librarian, might be able to manipulate the Gestalt field directly rather than just filtering it through wards. He began experimenting during his rest periods, when the Orks left him mostly alone. He would reach out with his psychic awareness, feeling for the currents of the Gestalt field that surrounded him. At first, trying to grasp it was like trying to hold water in his hands, the energy flowing around his will rather than responding to it. But gradually, Through careful practice and the application of techniques he'd learned over his long service, he began to find purchase. The key was not to impose his will on the Gestalt field like he would with normal psychic power. The field resisted that kind of direct control, its chaotic nature rejecting attempts at rigid structure. Instead, he had to work with its flow, suggesting directions rather than demanding them, encouraging certain patterns rather than forcing them. It was more like conducting music than executing a battle plan, and it required a flexibility that went against his training. But it worked. Slowly, incrementally, Castiel learned to nudge the Gestalt field, to create subtle ripples that influenced how the energy flowed around and through his chassis. He couldn't control it completely, not like he could his own psychic power, but he could guide it. And in guiding it, he could begin to shape not just his own systems, but potentially the environment around him. This discovery coincided with the preparations for Grogzag's raid. The Ork Nob had decided to attack a rival clan's settlement, and he wanted his prize Dreadnought at the forefront of the assault. The settlement was apparently built around a crashed Imperial transport ship, and the rival clan had been scavenging it for parts, a gross insult in Ork culture where salvage rights were taken very seriously. The war party that assembled for the raid was a typical Ork force, disorganized, heavily armed, and enthusiastically violent. Trucks and buggies revved their engines, belching black smoke into the air. Orks checked their weapons with the kind of casual maintenance that would horrify any Imperial armorer. Gretchen ran around trying to complete last-minute tasks while avoiding getting stepped on or shot. And at the center of it all, freshly painted and bristling with looted weapons, stood the modified Grey Knight's Dreadnought. Castiel used the journey to the rival settlement to continue his experimentation with the Gestalt field. He could feel it growing stronger as the Orks got more excited about the upcoming fight, their collective enthusiasm feeding the psychic energy that surrounded the entire war party. He practiced reaching out to this energy, learning its rhythms and flows, understanding how it responded to Ork emotions and expectations. By the time they arrived at the rival settlement, Castiel had achieved something remarkable. He had created a psychic feedback loop that connected his Aegis wards to the Gestalt field in a controlled manner. The wards were no longer just filtering the alien energy. They were actively channeling it, using it to enhance his systems while simultaneously protecting his consciousness from contamination. It was the most sophisticated piece of psychic engineering he had ever accomplished, and it was only possible because of the unique circumstances of his captivity. The battle itself was chaos, as all Ork battles are. The two clans clashed with no particular strategy beyond charge at the enemy and hit them really hard. Bullets flew in every direction. Explosions rocked the battlefield. Orks bellowed war cries in their guttural language while hacking at each other with choppers and blades. It was the antithesis of the disciplined combat operations Castiel remembered from his service with the Grey Knights, and yet there was a certain brutal efficiency to it. Castiel found himself in the thick of the fighting, with Grogzag directing him to smash through the rival clan's defensive positions. He activated the Mega Blaster, felt the Gestalt field surge through the weapon as it charged, and unleashed a beam of energy that punched through an Ork-modified barricade like it was paper. The rocket launcher fired again and again, each projectile guided by a combination of his targeting skills and the Gestalt field's tendency to make Ork weapons hit what they were pointed at. But it was in melee combat that Castiel discovered the true potential of his hybrid existence. When he activated the chain chopper and waded into a group of enemy Orks, he felt the Gestalt field respond to the violence, strengthening the weapon and increasing its lethality. His Aegis wards, instead of rejecting this enhancement, channeled it, focusing the chaotic energy into precise strikes that would have made his old battle brothers proud. And then, in the middle of the melee, Castiel attempted something that would have been considered absolute heresy by any Grey Knight. He consciously drew on the Gestalt field to enhance his own psychic power. He reached out with his awareness, grasped the swirling energies around him, and pulled them into the psychic conduits his aegis had created. The sensation was like drinking lightning, a surge of raw power that was completely unlike the controlled psychic techniques he had been trained in. The effect was immediate and dramatic. His aegis wards flared with an intensity they had never shown before, the silver light mixing with an emerald glow that came from the gestalt field. The combined energy created a psychic shockwave that radiated outward, and every orc within range, both friend and foe, suddenly felt an overwhelming compulsion to fight harder, to be more violent, to throw themselves into the battle with even greater enthusiasm. Zagbolt, who was watching the battle from a safe distance, felt it too and immediately understood what had happened. The metal Humi hadn't just been filtering the gestalt field, he'd been learning to use it, and now he was actively manipulating it, feeding energy back into the field in ways that influenced the other orcs. The weird boy's head began to hurt even worse than before, and he started shouting warnings that nobody could hear over the sounds of battle. Castiel, for his part, was experiencing a revelation that fundamentally challenged everything he thought he knew about psychic power and spiritual purity. He had used alien psychic energy, consciously and deliberately, to enhance his combat effectiveness. He had drawn on the gestalt field of Xenos and channeled it through his sacred aegis wards. By every measure of Grey Knight's doctrine, he had committed an act of contamination, of spiritual compromise. But he couldn't deny the results. He was more effective now than he had been at any point since his awakening. His weapons hit harder. His movements were faster. Even his consciousness felt sharper, clearer, as if the alien energy was burning away the fog that had accumulated during his long sleep. It was wrong. It violated everything he had been taught, but it worked in ways that pure Imperial psychic techniques never could have in his current situation. The battle ended in victory for Grogzag's clan, largely due to the devastating effectiveness of their modified Dreadnought. The rival Orks were driven off, and the crashed transport ship was claimed as new salvage. Grogzag was delighted, already planning how to use his metal Humi in future raids. The other Orks celebrated with their usual enthusiasm, firing weapons into the air and arguing about who had killed the most enemies. But Zagbolt approached Fragbits with a worried expression. "The metal Humi is getting stronger," he said quietly. "And he's learning to use our energy. I don't think he's just a tool no more, boss. I think he's figuring out how to be something else. Something we ain't seen before." Fragbits considered this warning, looking at the Dreadnought where it stood covered in the remains of enemies it had destroyed. The mech boy had to admit that the metal Humi was performing far better than any looted equipment should. The way it fought, the precision of its movements, the effectiveness of its weapons, it was like the machine was alive in a way that normal vehicles never were. "Keep watching it," Fragbits ordered, "and let me know if it starts doing anything too weird. But for now, as long as it keeps fighting for us, I say we leave it be." This would prove to be a critical decision, one that would have consequences far beyond what any of the Orks could imagine. Because Castiel, having learned that he could manipulate the gestalt field, was now formulating a plan that would require pushing those abilities to their absolute limit. He would use the Orks' own psychic power to engineer his escape, to turn their greatest strength into their worst vulnerability. The clash between Imperial psychic discipline and Ork gestalt energy had produced something unprecedented. A warrior who could wield both, who understood the principles of the Aegis, while also grasping the chaotic potential of the gestalt field. And that warrior, despite being trapped in a desecrated chassis, thousands of light years from any Imperial support, was about to become far more dangerous than any of his captors realized. Potential outcomes and catastrophic possibilities. The situation we have explored, a Grey Knight's Dreadnought captured and modified by Orks, creates a nexus of potential outcomes that range from the merely catastrophic to the completely reality-breaking. Each possibility branches from the fundamental incompatibility between Imperial psychic engineering and Ork gestalt phenomena, amplified by the presence of a conscious, willful mind that can manipulate both. Let's explore these potential futures and the implications they hold for everyone involved. The most straightforward outcome would be Castiel's successful escape. Having learned to manipulate the Gestalt field and integrate it with his Aegis wards, he could theoretically engineer a scenario where he breaks free from Ork control and fights his way to an Imperial world or outpost. This escape would likely involve waiting for the right moment, perhaps during a raid where Ork forces are scattered, and then using his hybrid capabilities to devastating effect against his captors. Such an escape would leave the Imperium with a troubling artifact, a Grey Knight's Dreadnought that had been contaminated by extended exposure to Xenos technology and psychic energy. The chapter would face difficult questions about whether Castiel could be trusted, whether the modifications should be removed or studied, whether his experience with the Gestalt field represents dangerous knowledge or valuable intelligence. His consciousness, having learned to work with alien psychic power, might be considered tainted even if his loyalty to the Emperor remained absolute. More disturbing would be if the modifications become permanent and irreversible. The interaction between the Aegis wards and the Gestalt field might create psychic bonds that cannot be safely broken without destroying the Dreadnought entirely. Castiel might find himself forever dependent on at least some Ork components, forever carrying a piece of Xenos contamination that he can never fully cleanse. For a Grey Knight, whose entire existence is defined by spiritual purity, this would be a fate worse than death, a permanent reminder of his violation. Another possibility is that other Orks learn from the success of Castiel's modification. If word spreads through the Greenskin clans about the amazing metal Humi that Grogzag's mech boys created, other Orks might start actively hunting for Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts or other highly psychically charged Imperial equipment to loot and modify. This could lead to a new Ork strategy, capturing and converting the Imperium's most sacred war machines, creating hybrid forces that combine Ork numbers and enthusiasm with Imperial precision and psychic power. The Inquisition's response to such a development would be immediate and merciless. The Ordo Xenos would launch purge campaigns to eliminate any Ork clan that had looted Grey Knight's equipment. The Ordo Malleus would be mobilized to prevent the spread of knowledge about how to modify psychically charged Imperial technology. Entire worlds might be subjected to exterminatus to ensure that no trace of this dangerous innovation survived. The political and military resources committed to containing this threat could destabilize entire sectors. But perhaps the most frightening possibility is that the hybrid psychic system Castiel has created might evolve beyond anyone's control. The interaction between structured Imperial psychic discipline and chaotic Ork Gestalt energy could create a feedback loop that grows stronger over time. The Aegis wards, designed to adapt to demonic threats, might continue adapting to the Gestalt field, becoming more efficient at channeling alien psychic power. The Gestalt field itself might begin to change, influenced by the structured patterns the Aegis imposes on it. This could lead to the emergence of something entirely new, a localized psychic phenomenon that combines the best aspects of both Imperial and Ork psychic traditions. Imagine a Gestalt field that maintains Ork enthusiasm and collective power, but channels it with Grey Knight's precision and purity. Or conversely, imagine Aegis wards that have been contaminated by chaos and unpredictability, but retain their fundamental resistance to demonic corruption. Either way, the result would be unprecedented and potentially uncontrollable. There's also the possibility that this hybrid system could spread beyond Castiel's chassis. Psychic phenomena can be contagious, especially in the presence of strong psychic fields and multiple psychers. If Zagbolt or other weird boys spend enough time near Castiel, if they study and try to replicate what he's doing, they might begin to develop abilities that no Ork has ever possessed. They could learn to structure their Gestalt field manipulation, to create lasting psychic constructs rather than temporary bursts of power. Ork weird boys who can channel the Gestalt field with Imperial precision would be terrifyingly effective. The demon implications cannot be ignored either. Demons are drawn to psychic power like moths to flame, and the hybrid system Castiel has created represents a unique and tempting target. The combination of Grey Knight's Aegis wards, designed specifically to repel demons, and Ork Gestalt field, which demons find difficult to corrupt due to its chaotic nature, creates a contradiction that might attract demonic attention specifically because it's so unusual. A demon trying to manifest near or possess Castiel would face a nightmarish puzzle. The Aegis wards would repel it as they're designed to do, but the Gestalt field permeating the same space would create openings and vulnerabilities that the wards can't completely close. The result might be a partially corrupted hybrid system, a Dreadnought that is simultaneously protected by Imperial psychic engineering and compromised by demonic influence. The consequences of such a state are almost impossible to predict, but would certainly be catastrophic. From a technological perspective, the Mechanicus would be horrified and fascinated in equal measure. A functioning hybrid of Imperial and Xenos technology represents everything they're supposed to prevent, but it also represents knowledge that could be invaluable. The temptation to study Castiel's chassis, to understand how such fundamentally incompatible systems were made to work together, might prove irresistible to certain tech priests, despite the obvious heresy involved. This could lead to a shadow conflict within the Mechanicus itself. Conservative factions would demand the immediate destruction of all knowledge related to the hybrid system. Progressive factions, the ones who believe in innovation even when it challenges established doctrine, would argue for careful study and controlled experimentation. The political battle could destabilize the Mechanicus's relationship with the wider Imperium, especially if the Inquisition gets involved. There's also the question of what happens to the Orks if Castiel successfully uses his hybrid powers against them. If he manages to turn the Gestalt field into a weapon, manipulating it to cause Ork weapons to malfunction, or Ork morale to collapse. It would represent the first time in recorded history that an Imperial warrior had successfully weaponized the Greenskins' own psychic power against them. The tactical and strategic implications would be enormous, potentially providing the Imperium with a new approach to fighting Ork crusades. But using such techniques would require other Imperial warriors to learn what Castiel has learned, to study and practice manipulating alien psychic energy. This would mean deliberately contaminating more Grey Knights or other psychers with Xenos psychic influence, creating more hybrid warriors who walk the line between purity and corruption. The ethical and spiritual costs of such a decision would be immense, possibly requiring direct intervention from the highest levels of Imperial authority to resolve. The long-term psychological effects on Castiel himself represent another potential outcome worth considering. He has already endured nearly 5,000 years of stasis sleep, the trauma of awakening in Xenos hands, the agony of watching his sacred chassis be desecrated, and the moral compromise of learning to use alien psychic power. If he survives all of this and returns to the Grey Knights, will he still be the warrior he once was? Or will the experience have changed him so fundamentally that he can never truly reintegrate with his chapter? Some Dreadnought pilots develop psychological conditions over the centuries of service, their personalities fragmenting or changing as the organic components of their brain slowly degrade. Castiel's experience is far more traumatic than the typical Dreadnought existence. The contamination he has endured, both technological and psychic, might leave permanent scars on his consciousness. He might become obsessed with Xenos threats, unable to trust any technology that hasn't been blessed and sanctified a dozen times. Or conversely, he might become too flexible, too willing to compromise spiritual purity for tactical advantage, making him unreliable in the eyes of his more orthodox brothers. The worst-case scenario, one that keeps inquisitors awake at night when they contemplate such things, would be if the hybrid system Castiel has created proves to be replicable and stable. If it turns out that combining Imperial psychic engineering with Ork Gestalt phenomena creates capabilities that are genuinely superior to either tradition alone, it would challenge fundamental assumptions about the superiority of Imperial technology and spiritual purity. Such a discovery could lead to dangerous innovation across the Imperium. Rogue tech priests might begin experimenting with Xenos Imperial hybrids. Radical inquisitors might authorize the creation of specialized units equipped with hybrid technology. The line between necessary innovation and dangerous heresy would blur to the point of meaninglessness, and the Imperium's already strained unity could fracture further as different factions adopted different standards for what constitutes acceptable contamination. Yet, there's also a possibility, however small, that this entire situation could have a positive outcome. Castiel could escape, bringing with him knowledge about Ork psychic phenomena that no other Imperial warrior has ever possessed. This knowledge could be carefully studied, its dangerous aspects contained, while its useful insights are extracted and applied. The Grey Knights could develop new wards specifically designed to counter or manipulate the Gestalt field, giving them an advantage in future conflicts with Orks. The experience might even lead to a deeper understanding of psychic phenomena in general. The fact that two fundamentally different forms of psychic power could be made to work together, even temporarily and at great cost, suggests that Imperial Psyker's understanding of the warp and psychic energy is incomplete. There might be underlying principles that transcend the divisions between Imperial, Xenos, and demonic psychic traditions, principles that could revolutionize how the Imperium approaches psychic warfare. As we conclude this exploration of what happens when Orks capture a Grey Knight's Dreadnought that has been asleep for nearly 5,000 years, we're left with more questions than answers. The scenario represents a collision of incompatible forces, a meeting of precise Imperial psychic engineering and chaotic Ork Gestalt phenomena, mediated by the will of a warrior who refuses to surrender despite impossible circumstances. The outcomes we've explored range from the personal, Castiel's individual fate and psychological state, to the cosmic, fundamental changes to how the Imperium and the Orks interact at a psychic level. Each possibility carries its own implications and consequences, creating a web of potential futures that could radically alter the balance of power in the galaxy. What's certain is that such a situation cannot exist indefinitely without resolution. Either Castiel escapes, or he doesn't. Either the hybrid system stabilizes, or it doesn't. Either the knowledge of what has been created spreads, or it's successfully contained. The tension between these possibilities creates a narrative that captures the essential grimdark nature of Warhammer 40,000. There are no good options, only choices between different forms of catastrophe. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, sometimes the most terrifying weapons are created not by design, but by accident. Not by the Imperium or the Xenos, but by the horrible collision between them. A Grey Knight's Dreadnought modified by Orks represents exactly such a weapon. Unprecedented, unpredictable, and potentially more dangerous than either side intended. And somewhere on a scrap heap whirled far from Imperial space, brother Ancient Castiel continues his vigil, trapped in a desecrated chassis, learning to wield powers he was never meant to touch, planning an escape that might never come, embodying a horror that exists in the spaces between doctrines and traditions, where no one thought to look until it was too late. Thank you for watching another deep dive into the lore of Warhammer 40,000. If you enjoyed this exploration of what happens when the Imperium's most sacred warriors encounter the galaxy's most unpredictable Xenos, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. We have many more stories to tell from the grim darkness of the far future, and your support helps us continue to bring you these detailed examinations of the 40K universe. Until next time, remember, in the darkness, there is only war, but sometimes that war creates things stranger and more terrible than anyone intended.